Hello everyone, and today we'll be covering tessellations, which is a form of 2D geometry. This exercise is located on page 16 and 17 on your Communicate Graphically booklet. Now, what are tessellations? Tessellations are patterns made up of shapes that fit perfectly together, like the examples that we could see on the top row. We have tessellations made up of squares, triangles, rectangles, hexagons, octagons, and so on. Now, in this exercise, you are going to be completing these patterns right here. Now let's start with the first example, which is a square tessellation. The dots are there to help us draw the square tessellation. Now up here we have our answer, our point of reference. So you would know how our tessellation should end up looking like. So let's zoom in and let's start completing our square tessellation. Now let's take out our ruler and pencil. So let's refer to our point of reference, and I can already see that this tessellation has 3 horizontal lines. So let's complete those. If I continue to make straight lines like this, instead of making the squares one by one, my tessellation would look much more neater. So those are the first 3 lines finished. Now make sure that all your lines are being drawn lightly. Now, there we have to draw another 3, but vertical lines this time. Alright, now there you go, our first tessellation is finished. Now let's move on to the other tessellation, which is a tessellation composed of rectangles. Alright, now as you can see, the first rectangle and the first half of a rectangle are already finished for you, and this is our point of reference. Now, by referring to this answer right here, I can already see that there are going to be 3 horizontal straight lines. So let's complete those. Again, I'm not going to draw each rectangle individually in order to make my work look much more neater. So that's one line. Let's do the second line. And then the third. Alright, let's continue by drawing the vertical lines now. On the first row, I can already see that there are going to be 2 vertical lines. One vertical line is finished, so let's complete this line right here. And there we have those 3 rectangles. Now, on the second row, I'm going to have 3 vertical lines for 4 rectangles. You know what? Let's take a shortcut. The second row is the same as the fourth row, as you could see here on the answer. So when drawing the vertical lines, you could easily draw the fourth row's vertical lines as well. So let's try and do that. That's our first line finished. And let's go to the fourth row and draw that line. So let's draw this line over here on the bottom line, on the bottom row, sorry. And let's draw these final two lines right here. So that's line 1 and then line 2 on the fourth row. There we go. Now let's complete the third row, which has 3 rectangles. So we have to draw only 2 vertical lines. Again, the third row is the same as the first row, so let's continue on that. That's the first line and the second. And there we have our second tessellation, composed of rectangles, is finished. Now let's move on to the third tessellation, which is made of triangles. So we have our first 3 triangles finished. Okay, now let's move on to the triangles tessellation. Here we have 3 triangles already finished for us, and here are the dots to basically indicate where the other triangles are located. Now before we start, I'm going to first analyze the tessellation from the reference image right here. So, this tessellation, you could either draw it by drawing each triangle individually, or you could draw it in this alternative method. So if you look at this tessellation well, you would notice that it is formed of 60-degree diagonal lines. So 60-degree diagonal lines going in this direction. The same diagonal lines are going in the opposite direction. And then you're going to have those horizontal lines. So let's start drawing it. Let's take out our ruler. And the first thing that I'm going to draw are these diagonal lines that go downwards from right to left. Okay, now let's start with those. Now remember to keep your line work as light as possible, so when you make a mistake, you would easily erase it. Now let's draw the other diagonal lines that go 60 degrees downwards from left to right. Now, same as we did before, align your ruler with the dots and then draw a light line. Again, align your ruler with the dots and draw your line. Now, what is left for us to do is to draw those horizontal lines to close our triangles. As you can see on the reference image, we have 3 horizontal lines. Okay, now, same as we did before, align your ruler with the dots. and draw your light horizontal line. Let's do the second line. And now the third. Alright, now that's finished. Now let's move on to the other tessellation, which is a tessellation made up of hexagons. Once again, we have 3 shapes all ready for us and the dots to indicate where the hexagons are going to be. Now, let's refer to our reference image and let's analyze this tessellation. And once again, we have certain lines that form the hexagon that fall under the same line. Like for example, these two lines here, okay, they fall under the same line. They're just divided by the space of a hexagon. Even vertically, we have lines which go vertically downwards. And we also have lines going in this direction from left to right downwards. Okay, now let's start with our tessellation. Alright, now we have those 3 shapes already finished for us. Now, let's start by drawing the lines going from left to right downwards. Now make sure that you know which lines you're supposed to be drawing. With your mind's eye, you have to form each hexagon with your mind, okay? You see, those 3 are supposed to be hexagons, and I'm going to be drawing one or two sides of these hexagons, going from left to right downwards. Always like this. A line, leave a gap for the hexagon, and then a line. To help you a little bit, you could first mark where the lines are going to be before you draw them. So, I've marked my lines, now I'm just going to go ahead and draw them. Now, it's important that when you mark them, you only draw a very thin light line. Okay, so if you make a mistake, you'll be able to erase it much easier. Okay, now let's draw the lines going from left to right upwards. Again, if you feel that you're getting a bit confused, first mark your lines before you actually draw them. Okay, always mark them with a thin light line. Now here, unfortunately, I forgot the last few lines. Please remember to draw them as well. Now let's move on to drawing the vertical lines to close our hexagons. Again, draw a line, leave a space for the hexagon, draw a line, and leave a space for the hexagon. That's the pattern that we're going with here. Now let's draw those missing 3 lines going from left to right upwards. And again, let's continue with the vertical lines. And there you have it, the hexagon's tessellation is finished. Now let's move on to the other one. Alright, now let's move on to the next page, page 17. And the next tessellation that we have is made up of octagons and squares. So here we have the octagon and square all ready for us, and the dots to help us connect them. This is our reference image. Now let's zoom in to analyze our reference image before we start drawing our tessellation. Now once again, I'm not going to be drawing each octagon individually, but I'm going to draw lines which fall under the same imaginary line. Let's call it that. Now here we're seeing lines, diagonal lines at 45 degrees that go from left to right upwards. Again, we have vertical lines and horizontal lines. And then we have lines going from left to right downwards as well. Again, at 45 degrees. Okay, now let's start with our octagons and squares tessellation. So the first two shapes are finished for us. Now let's start by drawing the horizontal lines. So first align your ruler with the first line. So space for a square, line, space for a square, line, space for a square, and another line. That's the pattern that we have to follow here. So space. As you can see, those are the hexagons. You have to imagine them with your mind's eye. So square, line, square, and another line. And finally another square. Now let's move on to drawing the vertical lines. So that's my hexagon, and that's the side that we're going to be drawing now. Once again, if you're confused, you can mark the lines before. You could mark where they're going to be. Again, do these as light as possible. And then you could go ahead and draw the actual lines for your answer. So let's draw these two lines over here. And then we have another tree on this side. All right. Now let's move on to the diagonal lines. The ones that go 45 degrees downwards from left to right. Once again, to not get confused, let's mark where the lines are going to be before we actually draw them. Now let's start. Align your ruler with the first two lines and then draw your line. Again, second line, third line. Let's erase that mark a little bit so it won't show in our final answer. And let's continue the same way. Always please make sure that your ruler is aligned with the same line of dots. Alright, now let's draw the other diagonal lines going from left to right upwards. Make sure that you align your ruler with the same line of dots before you draw your lines. And let's continue the last few lines that we have left, and then we'll be finished. The next tessellation is made up of triangles and hexagons. Now let's take a look at the reference image. Now I can already see that this tessellation is made up of 60-degree diagonal lines going in both directions. And we also have those two horizontal lines in the middle. Now, let's start. Let's start by drawing those two horizontal lines in the middle of our tessellation. Again, align your ruler with the line of dots and then draw your line. So those two lines are finished. And let's move on to drawing those diagonal lines which go from left to right downwards. Once again, align your ruler with the line of dots and then draw your line. Let's position our pencil in place. Align our ruler and then draw our line. Let's move on to the next line and continue this way. Now let's draw the diagonal lines which go from right to left downwards, and then we'll be finished. On to the next tessellation, which is made up of squares and triangles. Now let's take a look at the reference image. At first glance, I will notice immediately that the first, third, and fifth row are the same. They are all made out of squares. And the second and fourth row are made up of triangles. Okay, now let's start. In this tessellation, I'm first going to be drawing the horizontal lines. So, let's start with the second horizontal line of this tessellation, then the other horizontal line that closes the triangles, this horizontal line should close the second row of squares, and then the other horizontal line to close off the other row of triangles. So we know that the first, third, and fifth are going to be made up of squares. So let's start drawing those vertical lines to make those squares appear. There you go, that's the second row of squares. Now the third. Okay, and there you have it. That's the 3 rows of squares. Now let's complete the rows which are made up of triangles. So first, I'm going to be drawing all the lines going in this direction from left to right downwards. Let's draw the lines on the 4th row. Now let's start drawing those lines going from left to right upwards. Now to save time, I'm going to do the 2 rows at the same time. First align your ruler and then draw the lines. There you have it, this tessellation is now finished. Now let's move on to the next tessellation, which is made up of rhombuses at 60 degrees. Once again, like we did with the others, let's take a look at the reference image and analyze it well. So at first glance, I would immediately see that this tessellation is sort of made up of 3D cubes. But to draw it easily, I'm going to draw row by row. So I'm going to mark the first row. That's the first row that I'm going to start drawing. Okay? And step by step, I'm going to be completing it. So, do you see these patterns made up of like half a cube? So, to avoid getting you mixed up, first mark where the lines are going to be, like I'm doing here. Okay, and then you could start by drawing the lines. So first I finished the lines going from left to right downwards. Now let's move on to the vertical lines. And now let's move on to the lines going from left to right upwards. That's the first row finished. Now let's move on to the second row. The second row is formed out of these rhombuses. Here they look like diamond shapes. So let's continue by finishing this row of rhombuses or diamonds. Now here I'm pre-marking where the lines are going to be to avoid confusion. Make sure that when marking, you mark with a light line. That would be easy to erase afterwards. Always first align your ruler with the dots going into the same direction and then draw your line. Now the next row is formed out of rhombuses that look as if they're mirroring each other. So first I'm going to mark where my lines are going to be to avoid confusion. Make sure the markings are as light as possible, so you would erase them later. Now let's finish this zigzag line first. Here the marking was unfortunately far away from the proper line, therefore I erase it beforehand. Now here I'm doing the vertical lines. And then let's do the lines going from left to right upwards. Now once again, we're going to draw this pattern of rhombuses or diamonds. So let's start with the lines going from left to right downwards. And then let's continue with the lines going from left to right upwards. Once again, we're going to draw the pattern with the rhombuses mirroring each other. So first let's mark out the lines. Let's mark the zigzag line first to avoid confusion. And continue the same way. Okay, now let's finish the last row of rhombuses or diamonds, whatever you want to call them in this position. And let's finish the last row of vertical lines. And there you have it. This tessellation made out of rhombuses is finished. Now in part 2 of this video, I'm going to be showing you how to shade these tessellations.